And we are live. Welcome to the Whatever Podcast, coming to you live from Santa Barbara, California. I'm your host, Brian Atlas. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Warren Farrell. Warren Farrell is an American political scientist, activist, and author of several best-selling books, including The Boy Crisis, Why Our Boys Are Struggling and What We Can Do About It, as well as The Myth of Male Power, and Why Men Earn More. I don't have that one here, but it's online. His books are published in more than 50 countries and in 19 languages. He graduated with a master's from UCLA and a PhD from NYU, both in political science. He has taught at UC San Diego State, Brooklyn College, Georgetown University, and Rutgers University. Warren, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm really looking forward to our talk, Brian.
So I've known about you for well over a decade now. I'd read The Myth of Male Power in 2007. I was 18. Definitely had an impact on how I viewed things. So I've been very much looking forward to speaking with you today. So just first off, how was your International Men's Day, which was just on Saturday?
I understand good, but I didn't get much involved with it this time, except the Australian people did a really big International Men's Day, and I had some involvement with that. So it's, on the scheme of things, pretty much men's issues are pretty invisible to the culture. It seems like men are an issue, but they're not an issue to pay attention to in an empathetic way. And so part of my life has been spent recently. As you know, I was previously on the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City, and so I was sort of, I suppose, the world's leading male feminist for a while. But as I started seeing boys and men's having issues, I started paying attention to that. And once I started paying attention to that, I realized the issues were much deeper than I thought they were at the beginning.
Gotcha. And we'll definitely get into some of your background in a little bit. So as it relates to International Men's Day, and I bring it up because I wanted to get your reaction to, and maybe you've seen this, the UN Twitter posting this. Eric, can you switch over to the window tab, please? So this is from the UN Women page. They posted this on International Men's Day. Happy International Men's Day. Thank you to all men who support women and girls, share the care at home, advocate for gender equality. And there was a bit of pushback. And Eric, if you can go to the next one too. This is from, I believe, last year. Happy International Men's Day to all the male allies around the world who support women, defy gender roles, fight gender-based violence, and stand up for equality. And there's a bit of pushback on this because some people were commenting, well, you're making International Men's Day not really about men. Do you have a reaction to that, especially from such a large organization as the UN?
Yeah, it completely, it creates an understanding of why we need an International Men's Day, because that is a complete misunderstanding of what Men's Day is about. It is partially about that. I think every man involved with at least the perspectives on gender that I have, every one of us supports women. We support even #MeToo, because we want women to be able to express their feelings. We want women to be empowered, but we want #MeToo to be not a monologue, but a dialogue. We want International Men's Day to be able to be, we as men die earlier, 14 out of 15 of the leading causes of death. And there's 0 federal offices of men's health. There's 7 federal offices of women's health, even though they live 5 years longer, even though they're less likely to die out of 14 out of the 15 leading causes of death. We have women in the next few years. 2 women will be graduating from college for every male. That's a women's issue, and it's a men's issue too. And so we want to see it recognized as a women's issue, because we want women to have men who are worthy of their love. And there are very few women who graduate from college, who are interested in marrying male dropouts from college. And so everything, the complete misunderstanding about International Men's Day from the United Nations perspective is that the only real issues are women's issues, and we support men who support women. as opposed, and that's exactly what the gender studies has done in every university around the country. Gender studies has been defined as women's issues, and yes, we support men who support women. So which is completely missing the fact that there are just thousands of men's issues. Almost every father that is divorced that I know of, if he wishes to have equal amount of time with the children, he finds that there's often, and his wife is not interested in that. She has the right to the children, and he has to fight for children. That's not just a men's issue. So that is a children's issue, because children who don't have equal amounts of time with their fathers are much, much more likely to have problems in more than 70 different metrics, from suicide to likelihood to drop out of high school, to being unemployed, and so on. And so men's and boys' issues need attention, but the degree to which they need attention is in part reinforced by the complete blindness of the United Nations to anything about men that is of value, except to the degree that we support women.
Gotcha. Actually, Eric, we have a few more. If you can pull back up the window tab, if you can go over to the next one. So this was a bit surprising to me. So I don't know if you heard about this. This is from the UN, the United Nations Twitter. So they made, instead of announcing that November 19th was International Men's Day, the UN has made November 19th World Toilet Day.
World Toilet Day?
I don't know if you heard about this. So more people, they just posted this, I think, a day before what should have been International Men's Day, but more people in the world have mobile phones than toilets. On Saturdays, World Toilet Day, and they go on. And Eric, if you can tab over to the next one too. This was another post from the UN Twitter, mentioning World Toilet Day. By the way, no mention of International Men's Day. The UN Women's Twitter, they mentioned it, but it's kind of interesting that I don't know if there's anything malicious there. Eric, if you can go ahead and bring it back, but to put World Toilet Day on what is International Men's Day, which has existed much longer, seems like maybe some shots are being fired, so to speak.
It does suggest that men's issues should be flushed down the toilet, basically, and that we're the equivalent of what you put down the toilet, and it's sort of, and it's always a good way of looking at these things is imagine the reverse. Let us say on International Women's Day that same day was chosen to be International Toilet Day. Would some women feel like that was sort of a little bit of a slam on, first of all, dividing the attention from their issues to something else, and then that something else be a toilet?
Gotcha. We just have a few more here because the UN just keep going. Eric, if you could pull it back up. Head on over to the next one. I think these next ones are not related to International Women's Day. So I don't know if you saw this one. So this is UN Women, and the UN also mentioned this too, but the original UN Women account took it down, but we found it on this other one they have. So of all journalists killed in 2021, 11% were women. In 2020, this was 6%. Let us say out loud, stop targeting women journalists. Wow. So that's...
Yes, I did see that. But I didn't see the full context until you just showed it to me. And that is amazing. And again, one of the simplest things to do is to reverse things. And so if 89% of the people who were journalists who were killed, if they're women, and 11% were men, can you imagine the protest being that men were the ones that were targeted, especially since before, a few years ago, it was only 8% or 6% men. And so the emphasis, and that is very, it is though a good example of exactly what has been happening in the last years. in the last 50 years, actually. We've taken every way that we can empathize with women and magnified it. And if the 11% of the people that are killed are women and 89% are men, so let's say 9-to-1 ratio about, and we're empathizing with the the 10%, that of the 11%, that really shows you, why. The big question becomes is, why do we not have empathy for men? Now, I know the answer to that question, but the most important thing is the question. And and even just saying that, and just viewing it through the lens of that when a woman is killed, even if it's only 1 out of 10, 11%, we need to pay attention to that. If a man is killed, even if it's about 90%, we can ignore that.
Isn't that what happened with Boko Haram, where they had previously been, capturing boys or whatever, and then finally when they had captured some women, that's when there's all the international media attention. That's when I think the White House at the time kind of made some statements about it, and that's when it started getting attention, when they had captured, I don't know if they had killed them or the extent of it.
Boko Haram killed boys and captured women, and the capturing of a small number of women got all the attention, and the killing of the boys got none of the attention.
Got it. Just a few more from the UN, and then we'll get on to my main questions. Eric, if you can pull up the window tab once more. If you want to head over to the next one, Eric. This is the same one, but from 4 years ago, so it's kind of just what we already talked about. 19% of journalists killed in 2017 were women. You can go to the next one, Eric. This is an interesting one. In countries facing conflicts and crises, women and girls often eat least and last. Their specific needs must be prioritized in humanitarian response efforts, which I think is kind of interesting in light of what's going on in Ukraine, because, women and girls were allowed to leave the country, but men, I think between the ages of 18 and 60 or 65, were required to stay,
Yes. So let's make it clear to the average listener first,
Sure.
who doesn't know about this.
Yeah.
In the Ukraine, it is true that every male between the age of 18 and 60 is required to stay in the Ukraine. And he must serve in some way, either in the war directly or in some other service capacity. The percentage of women that are required to stay in the Ukraine are 0%. That is, women are allowed to do what they choose to do. Now, many of these men, you may say, well, women are often with the children, but many of these men are fathers as well. And so they are often with the children, and the children we know do very much better when they have about an equal amount of fathering and mothering. And so there was no provision for men with children being able to leave or to stay in the Ukraine. Now, I'm extremely empathetic to the Ukraine, but the gender difference is really apparent there. It's apparent in almost every country that has wars. In Russia, the requirement is for the males to be drafted, not the females to be drafted. In the United States, if you have a son and you're listening to this, and your son is about to turn 18, when your son turns 18, he must register for the draft. He has no option. If he doesn't register for the draft, he does have an option. He cannot register for the draft and subject himself to a half a year in prison, to a $250,000 fine. In 42 states, he will be deprived of a driver's license. He will not be able to work for any government agency or go to any university that gets government funding. Virtually every university gets government funding through Pell Grants and things like that. So he's basically, if he wants to work for the post office, he's not even allowed to apply for an application to work for the post office because it's a government agency. So he's basically barred from a good percentage of life. And of course, if his driver's license is taken from him, he's dysfunctional. He's created as a dysfunctional person in terms of getting jobs, going places, getting married, and so on. And so this is the discrimination against males. Now, this discrimination against males in being required to be the only ones to register for a potential draft This discrimination against males is completely unconstitutional. It violates the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment states that there has to be equal protection based on things including sex and gender, and so and this is in violation of that. But because it's so deeply ingrained, it is not even brought up as an issue. And when it was brought up, although it was brought up a little bit as an issue about 4 years ago, and then President Biden made it clear that that was not going to be. He did not want the Supreme Court. He told the Supreme Court he did not want them pursuing the issue of male-only draft registration being unconstitutional. And apparently the court did pay attention to that.
What do you think is more, I mean, I kind of have a sense, but what do you think is more likely, either the equalization of the draft or the draft being done away with? I don't think it's likely that the draft would be done away with, because plausibly there could be a scenario in the future where we would need a draft. But do you have a sense of...
All enlightened people wish the draft were done away with, but all human beings who live in the world know that, well, today there's the Ukraine situation, and Russia could really create a situation where we would need people immediately to go over there. We signed a contract to be able to support Taiwan if there was an invasion by China in Taiwan. So we would immediately need to draw upon people. And what do we draw upon? We would draw upon the people who have registered for the draft, because that's the very purpose of registering for the draft, is to be able to be quickly drawn upon. Now, what would equality look like? Let's say that there was, we retained we retained draft registration. It would be perfectly fine at the age of 18 to have everyone sign up for some type of service to the country, women and men. And so, and then we discover what are people's capabilities. I would not be a good soldier, but I hope I would be I do couples communication counseling all around workshops all around the country. And my talent might be helping people who are officers be able to communicate with each other around differences, help Republicans and Democrats and men and women understand each other's perspectives on things. So I might not be that great in that type of situation for the actual combat roles, but I hope I would be able to serve the country in terms of helping people coordinate and empathize with different perspectives so that they can come to decisions well. So we could have men and women serve with an articulation of their talents, and then as needed in a time of war, they are called up by some lottery system or whatever, and then assigned to serve the country in a way that they're needed. Or we could require everyone to serve the country for 6 months or a year in one capacity or another when they become 18, and then when they complete that service, they are eligible to vote. That the whole concept of serving in the services was originally, and serving in war, that was originally tied to the vote. You served the country. You said you would risk your life for the country, and then you were able to vote. Women didn't have to serve, and they also they didn't have to vote. They didn't vote, and they weren't allowed to vote. But they also weren't required to register to die in World War I, World War II, or the Civil War. In the Civil War, 600,000 people were killed. 600,000 were men, and one was a woman who was killed by a stray bullet. And so there's that type of ratio of disposability. And this is why we don't, by the way, care about men or men's issues, because historically and biologically, men were trained to be disposable at war and disposable at work. And if you're a mother or a father, just think about this for a moment. And on the one hand, you have a picture of Uncle Joe who served in the Marines and died in the Marines on your mantle, and you're telling your son that Uncle Joe gave his life for his country and prevented the United States from being ruled by the Nazis. We are really proud of Uncle Joe. And Jimmy, the 14-year-old boy is hearing this and thinking that he's being criticized by mom, dad, and the kids at school, but he could be praised and be a hero someday if he joins the Marines. And so he begins to, so mom and dad, on the one hand, love Jimmy and want Jimmy to be safe. On the other hand, they're through their social bribes, the social bribe of calling somebody a hero. When we call somebody a hero, that's a social bribe to have them do whatever makes them a hero. And in this case, that would be being willing to risk their lives in war. So mom and dad's psychological attachment to Jimmy is much more divided than it is for Susie. Because for Jimmy, they on the one hand are going to be proud of him if he's willing to die in war. And so you can't develop as much psychological attachment to somebody you know you may lose as you can to your daughter, who all of your emotional eggs are in the basket of supporting your daughter. And one of the reasons there's so much anger toward men, I mean, men, well, first of all, it's male toxicities, which there's a lot of. And liberals usually say male toxicities, and then they say it comes from male privilege. Well, it is true, as every liberal knows, that there's plenty of male toxicities. But those male toxicities do not emanate from male privilege. They emanate from male sacrifice. When you are in a boot camp or you learn that you have to tough it out in any way, shape, or form, you're also learning that your feelings don't count, your fears don't count. So you keep your emotions and your fears to yourself, and eventually, if you either disconnect from your feelings altogether, which is a mental health problem, and men have basically been trained to have a mental health problem of repressing their feelings rather than expressing their feelings, and eventually repressed feelings either internally eat you up, or you act out and you externalize them by doing something, in the worst case scenario, like a mass shooting or committing suicide or homicide. And so this is an example of the men's issues we need to work on, but they're so deeply ingrained in all animals that the female animal would almost always want to reproduce with the male that had the biggest antlers, or it was the strongest male. And so the Lois Lane fell in love with Superman, but she had no interest whatsoever in Clark Kent. Clark Kent obviously is the same person as Superman, but until she understood that he was Superman, she had no interest in him. And then she saw herself contributing to Superman as a result of by saying, "Oh, Superman, you should learn how to cry also." But she was not interested in the man who knew how to cry, Clark Kent, until she knew that he was Superman first, and then able to be emotionally expressive afterwards.
Gotcha. I have just a few more of these UN things. Eric, if you can just go over to the next tab, and we don't have to have you respond to the rest of these, but actually, this is sort of related to the UN one about how what was it, 11% of journalists that are killed are women. This was in a newspaper article. I don't know if you've seen this. 1 in 4 homeless people are women, just kind of in the same vein. And I just find that funny to highlight in that way. Eric, if you could just go to the next one. Oh, and this just goes back to International Men's Day. So, and we don't really have to comment on this. I just wanted to show you this. So Google does these Google Doodles. So when you go to Google, it'll show you like a little art, and they'll do this on holidays and whatnot. So International Women's Day, and this is only till 2020, but this has been consistent even up until this year. They'll do a doodle for Women's Day, but not for Men's Day. Eric, if you can just go to the next one. And then
I think, just go back to that for a second. I want to show something. What's very interesting is you see all these doodles for International Women's Day, and then on the International Men's Day side, the only thing you see is whatever, which is kind of that is in essence the statement about International Men's Day, whatever.
So, anyways, moving on from that, so. You've already went over a whole bunch of things. My first question was going to just be, and you already kind of touched on a ton of this. What I wanted to do is just to get us started is if you can just rapid fire the top 10 ways in which men or boys are disadvantaged in society? You don't have to go super in depth, but if you just had to, off the top of your head, the top 10 ways, short little plot synopsis.
Well, one of the biggest ways is after divorce. And one of the biggest ways that has the most damage is after divorce. My research for the boy crisis found that children who do best are ones that have, after divorce, 4 things. One is an equal amount of time with mom and dad. Number 2 is the boy or girl experiences no bad mouthing from dad to mom or mom to dad. Number 3 is that the mom and dad be involved in couples communication counseling or relationship counseling on a consistent basis, not an emergency basis. And number 4 is that there's the mom and dad live within about 20 minutes drive time from each other. And so so that's what I put forth in my writings, a book called Father and Child Reunion, and more recently in the book called The Boy Crisis, found that the levels of the numbers of people that the number of problems that boys and girls have when they don't have a significant amount of father involvement exceeds 70 problems from drug problems and dropping out of school, as I was mentioning before. And so the fact that the number one issue is that after divorce, that the assumption is that moms have the right to children and dads have to fight for children. And so I do a lot of expert witness work, and because I feel that way about children should have the right to both parents, I should get an equal number of calls from mothers and fathers asking me to testify in court about why it's important to have both parents after divorce. Instead, I've gotten about more than 100 calls from men asking me to testify about being equally involved with their children after divorce, and only 1 call from women asking me to do that. And so that is a real, so it's a 100-to-1 ratio of calls that I've received around that issue. And so that's one example of an issue that has enormous impact on the next generation. Another issue is certainly the I'd say male birth control being available, birth control being available for females and versus males, and we have the whole abortion issue is focused on it's a woman's right to life, versus the fetus's right to life, and no one is working on the issue of why are we not talking about the father and the mother both being required to be able to possibly be the raiser of the children rather than having the fetus aborted. So we should be talking of the abortion issue in terms of 3 sets of rights. The right of the fetus to live, the right of the mother to be able to do an abortion, the right of the father to be able to be involved with the children rather than having the child be aborted. And so no one's even discussing that issue.
And any thoughts on legal paternal surrender? Or wait, hold on, what am I thinking? It's, I'm trying to think of the term. The sometimes not so well put term is paper abortion. I'm trying to think what the more eloquent term is. I think it's legal paternal surrender.
Tell me more about that.
Well, this idea that, so in the scenario where a woman, let's say the man doesn't want to keep the child or have the child, or not even necessarily that, but doesn't necessarily want to be financially responsible, but the mother wants to continue with the pregnancy. There's been a growing movement for men to say, hey, if you have the right to abort the child, I don't want to be financially responsible for the child.
Yes.
So it's sometimes called paper abortion, sometimes called legal paternal surrender. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, it shouldn't be called paper abortion. It should be called legal surrender.
Yeah.
And yes, I think that is an option that should be considered. But I think that the moment a mother discovers that she has a fetus, and she should be required to report that to the biological dad. And if she doesn't know who the biological dad is, get the testing to find out who the biological dad is. And then that biological dad should be contacted. And the purpose of her contacting him is to say, if she's considering the possibility of an abortion, to say, do you have an interest in signing a legal document saying that you will care for this child, this fetus, from the moment it's born until it becomes an adult, both economically and emotionally. And if he's willing to sign that he's willing to care for that child economically and emotionally, then he should have that right, rather than. And so, does she then have the obligation to bring it to term? Yes, she does. So when two people have engaged in sex, they have responsibilities, and those responsibilities and while there's a good argument to be made that a mother's life is being changed enormously if she goes ahead and is not able to have an abortion. There's also a good argument to be made that a fetus in the womb that could be viable is a type of murder. And there's also a good argument to be made about why are we not bringing the potential father into the equation. So one possibility is him signing something saying he will support that child for the rest of its life, child part of its life. And the other is that she should be required to contact the father and say, I want to let you know about this, so that if you want to participate in caring for this child with me, that you have that right, as opposed to her making the decision, which 42% of women who have children today raise their children on their own. That's an unfair burden to moms. It's unfair to the children, and it's unfair to any man who hasn't been contacted to let him know that this is your child as well as my child, and you have the right to do the caring. So the men should have ABC rights, men's ABC rights, the right of having a say in the abortion, the right of having the say in birth control, and the right of having the say in the caring for the children. And so this would be men's ABC rights in these areas. And if there's an interest in somebody exploring this more deeply, I talk about it somewhat in the Boy Crisis book, and I outline it in a full chapter in a book called Father and Child Reunion.
Gotcha. I want to ask you, have you heard of Andrew Tate?
Mm-hmm. Sure, who's often called the misogynist.
Yeah. So, and I don't know if I've heard you speak on him yet. Maybe you have. Maybe I just didn't catch it. But
I have not.
Okay, so we've got the world first exclusive here. So, what are your thoughts on Andrew Tate?
I would have to hear specific things that somebody feels has said or done, and then I would respond, to that specific statement.
Sure. Okay. Let me think if I can think of some examples. He's certainly said some very controversial things, and he's also said some very, I think, inspiring things. And he's told young adult men, boys, that hey, you should. I don't want to misquote him, but that you need to bear some responsibility. You need to, for example, just because you don't feel like doing something, for example, working out or getting fit, that shouldn't be a factor in whether you do it or not. It's just what is good for you, and then you just do it regardless of how you feel, because that's sort of your almost duty as a man, or your responsibility or job as a man.
It's a responsibility to learn how to do things you don't want to do, whether you're a male or a female.
Yes.
And I 100% agree with him about that.
Yeah. And I'm I wish I had loaded up some clips that we could have watched. Are there any things
the only thing I'll say is that anytime you put down a woman, you bring out the feminist in me. I am a very strong supporter of women's rights and the expansion of women's rights. I just don't want them to be male rights boys and men to be left out of the picture. I think that when we're all in the same family boat, when either sex wins alone, both sexes lose.
Yeah. But you've heard maybe some of the news stories about him, and I do think to some degree there was a bit of misrepresentation about some of the things that, there were accusations about him that he beat women, and then the woman in question came out and said, well, it was a consensual play between us. We were into some more
sadomasochism type of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So she came out, and then there's some accusations that he was doing human trafficking, but that was debunked. But I assume you're to some degree familiar with him. And I mean, he was the most Googled man at one point. He was, you maybe heard he was widely canceled. He was deleted on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Well, he just got his Twitter back. Widely publicized in news publications that, hey, this guy's a monster, and, banned him on TikTok. I think some of his banks closed his accounts.
Wow.
So pretty widely canceled. But do you think that the rise of someone like Andrew Tate is sort of the natural result of, at least as far as what I see, is decades of casual misandry and I guess the indoctrination of men and boys to have contempt for themselves and view themselves as less than simply for being men? Basically, I guess the pendulum swinging the other way in response to the overreaches of feminism.
Basically, yes. And and I see this with almost every example. I was doing an interview for some publication, and we were sitting. We were in the woods where I live in Mill Valley, California, and so they were asking me questions like this, and I started to say something about many boys in high school, and at exactly that moment, a boy that looked about high school age started passing by. And I said, I'm not a boy in high school anymore. You could slightly notice it from the gray hair. And so would you mind, the camera crew, if I asked this boy if he's willing to come over and just talk with us for a few moments? And they looked at me like, "You're really doing this?" And I told the boy what we were doing. I said, "Are you in high school?" And he said, "Yes, I'm a junior in high school." And he said, I said, "Could you just," and he's now on camera, and we asked for permission, et cetera, and told him what we're doing. And he goes ahead and says, "Well, I hear in school, like, about when it comes to masculinity, what do you hear? Oh, what's the word you associate it with masculinity in school? The word toxic, and what about the word with female? Oh, the future is female." And I went on and on like this. I said, "Well, do you feel like boys and men have any issues?" And I said, "Well," he said, "a lot of the boys are struggling in school." And if you brought up boys' issues, the things that you felt about, hearing that the future is female and masculinity is toxic, and the world is about male privilege. If you brought this up with your girlfriend, do you have a girlfriend first? And then, yes, I do. If you brought this up with your girlfriend, what do you think she would say? He said, "I wouldn't bring it up with my girlfriend. I wouldn't bring it up with my girlfriend." Now, to me, that was so sad. And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Well, she'd think I'm some type of misogynist." She'd think you're a misogynist just for bringing it up? Yeah. I said, "If you get really close to her and you're thinking about marrying her, would you bring it up?" Maybe. And so when boys are both hearing these things and taking in that when boys are having the struggles in school and much more likely to drop out of high school than girls, much more likely to feel that they're part of, and this is what boys learn and girls learn both in schools, is that we have, in junior high school, is that we live in a patriarchal world in which men made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women. And you, if you're a male, you're part of that male privileged patriarchy. And the future is female. Now, can you imagine growing up and you're struggling in school and you're the one more likely to drop out and you're not motivated and you're told instead, when I was in high school, a lot of guys were pretty goof-off guys until about junior year. And then we learned that nobody would respect us. No girl would be interested in marrying us if we didn't get our act together. And around junior year, about 80% of the guys got their act together, and the other ones were considered the losers. Or we got our act together when we got married and had a child that was born. And so nowadays, a lot of guys are just feeling that they are that there's no empathy for them and their issues, and that they can't even speak up about that. And whenever you have people feeling that they have to keep, so here we have one of boys' issues, that one of their legitimate toxicities is not being able to express their feelings. And we are living in an era in which boys are told not to express their feelings even more, reinforcing the toxicities. One of those toxicities is not expressing their feelings, and we're going to solve that toxicity by telling them there's a whole series of other areas called your feelings that you shouldn't express. So we're reinforcing the toxicities we're complaining about.
You know what? We actually might have a video clip we could potentially pull up of Tate. I'm trying to think which one. It's sort of related to dating a little. And we'll move.
Let's not worry about Tate.
Yeah, we'll move. Sure. We'll move on. So you mentioned patriarchy. Do you think that we live in a patriarchy today?
The problem, the world was not designed. We did not live in a world dominated by a patriarchy. We lived in a world dominated by the need to survive. To survive, neither sex had rights. Both sexes had responsibilities and obligations. When my father and mother were growing up, they never talked about rights, either one of them. They talked about responsibilities and obligations. When it seemed like I was going to be a decent writer, my father pulled me aside and he said, "Warren, I just want you to know, if you're thinking about becoming a writer, that there's only a chance in about 1 in 100 that you'll find a publisher. If you can't find a publisher, you'll never find a wife." And so it was made clear to me, and and then years later, as I did find a publisher and was making a living from writing, I was speaking all around the world on gender issues, and my father came over to visit me in California when I moved out to California. And for 3 days, he didn't sort of ask me a question about himself, about me rather. And after 3 days, I said to him, "What is this about, Dad? You're not even, I've shown a lot of interest in you and Mom, but you've shown no reverse interest." And it was a long silence. And he said, "Well, I want to keep our relationship good." And I said, "You don't keep a relationship good by not talking about the other person." And he said, "Well, are you really open to hearing what I really feel?" And I said, "Yes, Dad, I'd rather have that than," I gather it's negative, but I'd rather have that than no dialogue at all. And he said, "Well, I think that the work you're doing is ruining the lives of millions of people." And so I said, "Wow." But and I made a joke out of it at first. I said, "I'm really not affecting millions of people." And then I said to him, "Well, tell me more. Why do you feel that way?" And he said, "Well, because you're teaching people psychology. And teaching people psychology is teaching people what they want to do, what they want to be. And Warren, to be a man, life is not about, or an adult woman, life is not about doing what you want to do. It's about doing what you need to do. It's about being responsible, and it's about fulfilling obligations. It's not about wants." And it wasn't until years later that I said to him that, your generation, Dad, created the ability to be able to survive, so that your children didn't have to worry nearly as much about survival. And we were able to think instead about what we wanted, what our passion was. And the word passion was never an issue for the average person worrying about survival. And so the world we lived in was dominated not by a patriarchy, but by that need to survive. And what's happened is that women have been the first ones that have been able to move past that survival. Women who have been married to men who are middle class men or above, where the men supply, where when the child is born, oftentimes the woman says, I have three options if she's middle class or above in the United States. Option one is to raise the children full time, which 40% of children in America, mothers in America do that are married to men. Option two is to be full time in the workplace, which another 40% do. And option three is to be work part time, which 20% do. And so men say, I have three options too. Option one is I can work full time. Option two is I can work full time. And option three is I can work full time. And so and if we call that a patriarchal system in which the word patriarchy is used in such a way that suggests that it's a system created by men for men at the expense of women, that is completely inaccurate. Men and women both made sacrifices. Men made sacrifices of dying in war. And women made sacrifices in risking their lives in childbirth. And women made sacrifices raising children. Men made sacrifices raising money. But the mistake the feminist movement made was it took men's obligation to raise children, which was an obligation to earn more money than he was doing before, to quitting things he loved to do, like being a musician, an artist, or an actor, or a writer, or an elementary school teacher, and saying that, I'm not making enough money as an elementary school teacher. I'll become an administrator, a principal, or superintendent of schools. The feminists and so he ended up quitting jobs that earned less money once children were born, taking jobs that earned more that he liked less, that made him lose his passion, that made him often turn to drinking. And he did that instead. And then the feminists turned that propensity of a father to earn more money so he could give his children a better life than he had. And they turned that around and said, aha, look, men are earning more money. That means they have more male privilege, and they're part of the patriarchy, making rules to benefit men at the expense of women, as opposed to realizing that was part of men's obligation and sacrifice.
So do you think that we live in a gynocentric society?
I know what gynocentric means, but define it for the listener.
Oh gosh. Okay, hold on. Let me. Well, just so I make sure I get it perfectly correct, but woman-centric, centered. I pulled it up on Google just to make sure I don't want to get it wrong. Centered on or concerned exclusively with women.
I would say it's not exclusively, but darn close to it at this point in history. But the sad thing is not just that it's focused almost exclusively on women's issues and women's concerns, as we can see from all the things you pulled up about the United Nations. And it's not just a country, it's a world, like the United Nations reflects. But we're unconscious that that's the case. That, so for example, when men and women are 85 or older, men commit suicide 1,750% more frequently than women do. Now, if
how much?
1,750% more frequently than women do, and at the age of 85 or older. Or if we start at the younger age, at the age of 9, boys and girls rarely commit suicide, and when they do, they commit suicide about equally. Between the ages of 10 and 14, boys commit suicide at twice the rate of girls. Between the ages of 15 and 19, 4 times the rate. Between the ages of 20 and 25, about 4.5, 5 times the rate. And very few people even know that. And so it's the fact that very few people even know that is the gynocentric dimension of that.
I've had this conversation before, and I've brought up the suicide statistic, and the counter I often get to that is, well, women attempt suicide more than men. Is that true? Is that true? I know men certainly are successful more at committing suicide. Maybe that's why there's not repeat attempts. But is it even true that women attempt suicide more? I'm not convinced that that's the case.
It is the case.
Okay.
But here's the difference. The women attempt suicide more because when you attempt suicide, you're letting people, but not committing it. You're letting you believe that there's someone who loves you, someone who needs you, someone who's willing to help you, but you are calling to them to take you and your concerns off their back burner and put you on their front burner and pay attention to your needs and your feelings and your fears. So the attempt of suicide is calling people who love you, care for you, need you to your attention. So attempting suicide is a terrible thing, but it's also a part of the solution. Whereas committing suicide is not part of the solution. And here's, so in the Boy Crisis book, I have 63 red flags of preventing suicide or severe depression. And some of those red flags that are male style in orientation. So some of those things, some of those red flags is asking a boy, and I really encourage people, this is an inventory that I've created, that I'm really encouraging guidance counselors and psychologists in schools to pass out to all their boys and girls in school. But these are ways of expressing challenges that lead to suicidal ideations. And so the first question is, do you feel that there is no one who loves you? Second question, do you feel that there's no one who needs you? Third question is, do you feel that if you told somebody that you about this, they wouldn't know, that they would lose respect for you? And so it goes on and on. Like these are things that males do, and for the most case part, when males feel that there's nobody who loves them and nobody who needs them, and if they did share the problems that they're feeling and fears that they have, the friends that they believe they have would start losing respect for them. Those are 3 of 63 little signs that male feels there's no reason for living. Mm-hmm. So the suicide is saying there's no hope. And then another question is, do you feel there's any hope of that changing? And so if he feels there's no hope of that changing, he feels there's no one that cares for him, no one that needs him, that's when he's likely to cancel out.
Gotcha. And I know the rest of that list, it is in the Boy Crisis, your book. Sort of shifting gears here really quick. We have a short clip from a 90s interview you did with Barbara Walters. Eric, can you pull that up real quick? It's in the video tab. It's that one. Go ahead.
And if we don't question the male role to a greater degree in the next 25 years, we are talking about the potential extinction of the species.
So I think that was about 25 years ago. So how are things looking? Have things gotten better? Have things gotten worse?
I wish I could say that things have gotten better. And first of all, where did that black hair go?
I don't. Yeah,
that must be the sign of the extinction of the species.
Could be.
Let's see. No, I think things have gotten worse in the last 20 years. So here's an example. And what could have made things better, like #MeToo and women speaking up to men about, here's the way that you have offended me, hurt me, made me feel challenged, made me afraid of you. I think, as I said at the beginning of the interview, that #MeToo was wonderful, but what's terrible about it is that it's a monologue, and it only reinforced the belief that men were bad and women were good. The problem is that it was not a dialogue. So when I have been on college campuses, and I always do experiential work in which I have women and men walk a mile in each other's moccasins. And as a result of that, I'm sometimes asked, about only 4 or 5 times, but by somebody that there's been an accusation in the campus recently of date rape. And so when I talk to the guy about that, or when I talk with hear out the woman on that issue, and I say I'll be happy to hear both of them individually as long as they both agree that they'll get together and hear each other. And at the end, in that process, where everybody learns the most, the woman is saying something like, I said no and you came on to me. And even though I said no, and what was there about no that you couldn't understand? And that was really terrible. And the guy goes and says something like, well, you did say no, but you also said, you also did something like you really winked at me, and then you kissed me afterwards, and you sort of flirted with me, and I began to feel like that you sort of turned around on that issue, and that had evolved. And she will go, well, what do you mean? How did I flirt with you? And he'll try to imitate her flirting, and she starts beginning to say, oh yeah, I guess I did do that. And and then we'll talk about, well, did you have any ambivalence about that? And she goes, well, I guess in some ways I did. So what is not understood was that when that woman says no, the male doesn't know whether that's a no forever. I'm never interested in your kissing me. That's a no for a few minutes while maybe I have another sip of wine and get more relaxed, or another sip of coffee and wake up more, or that we do a little dancing together first, or that you ask me more about myself, or you talk a little bit more about yourself so I get to know who you are a bit more. And so there's and if it is no for the rest of this date, is there a way that if you respond differently, if you feel differently, will you maybe speak up and tell me when you change interest? So what we're doing in the feminist movement is we're telling women to articulate when they feel offended by a man coming on too quickly, but we're not saying to the women, if you feel a man is coming on too quickly, you need to say to the man, you're coming on too quickly. However, it's clear to me that you're interested at a point in time when I'm not. So if I change my mind, I have zero fear of rejection by you because I know that you're already interested. So I'll speak up and say if my desire changes. That would be at least the female partially sharing responsibility. We need to also say to our daughters that you, instead of expecting the man to hold your hand first and kiss you first, or do tongue kissing first, or touch you in the genitals first, that you need to be doing that about half the time first, and risking rejection from him. And so if we're going to prepare our daughters to be future executives, to be future business owners, to be future inventors, what's common to the top executives, top business owners, top inventors is risk taking. And when we ask boys to take all the risks and ask girls to only complain when they feel like those risks have been taken in a way that's inappropriate at that moment, we're teaching our daughters to complain, but we're not teaching our daughters to share the responsibility of those risks. And that's treating our daughters with respect and with maturity and with preparation to do the risk-taking that all entrepreneurs have to face and that all inventors face. And that's where we should be preparing for our daughters. And that's what comes out of a dialogue. And that's what's been missing in the last 50 years, has been a dialogue about gender issues.
Gotcha. I want to shift gears here a little bit. Are you familiar with someone named Rollo Tomasi? Sorry, Rollo. We actually have him in the chat right now. He wrote a book called The Rational Male. Have you heard of?
Yes, I've heard of the.
Have you read The Rational Male?
I have not, and I have. Okay. But I have heard of him and heard the book.
Yeah, he just says his best book is actually Why Men Are the Way They Are from 1988, and then he says Myth of Male Power is a close second, then Why Women Earn Less. That would be really interesting to get both of you to have a conversation. I'm sure he's probably down to do it. But
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
he has his own live stream, and he'll do it via Zoom probably. So maybe I could get you guys connected. But so I have a couple questions here that were submitted to Reddit. I posted on a couple subreddits, and so I have some submitted questions here. These first few are from r/men's rights. Silent Boo writes, ask him how he stays optimistic with all the statistics and morose and depressing subject matter in his books.
When my wife and I get together, she always finds the pessimistic side of things, and she just counts on me to find the optimistic side of things. I've always had two, core parts of my personality. One is, sort of looking at things with the sad realism, that I've been sharing with you, and on the other hand, feeling that I've always wanted to contribute to what I felt was being less well heard. And one of the reasons I was so quick to be involved with the women's movement is because I felt, when the women's movement surfaced in 1969, this part of the women's movement surfaced in 1969, we were calling women bra burners and man haters and so on. Well, there's a fair amount of man hating in there, but I also felt that there was a lot of things that women were saying that needed to be heard, and that the man hating part was, let's not label these women man haters. And so I felt that if I spoke up and also shared why many of women's perspectives needed to be heard, that it would be hard for them to call me a man hater. And so I had a way of, I wanted people to hear what was missing. But as boys and men's issues became the missing issues, and the importance of fathers became missing, I began to start saying this had to be part of the dialogue. And so my optimism is that that historically speaking, for millions of years, men and women had very strict roles, and we can't expect them to change in an evolutionary instant. That this dialogue, this misunderstanding, this emanates naturally from our desire to protect women, and our unwillingness to hear men is part of the problem. That women never sought men to protect. They always sought men to be their protectors. And so a man who complains and talks about his issues is a man who's seems to a woman to be whining and complaining. And so therefore that's biologically unnatural for a woman to be attracted to a man who's whining and complaining. So I saw this as a evolutionary issue, and evolutionary issues do not take 5, 10, 15, 20 years to evolve. They take a dialogue. They take the stage that we're at now is just a continuation of the old evolution in which women shared what was bothering them, and we men fought to be the protector. And this is a stage that we must evolve through.
Gotcha. And I have quite a few of these, so I'll try to get through them as quick as possible. So another one from r/men's rights. This is from Shit Zen Giggles writes, I'd be interested to know how he feels about Florida Governor Ron DeSantis vetoing the default shared custody bill that was part of the policy package, which was based on and inspired by Warren's book, The Boy Crisis. So yeah, what happened in Florida? I think it was the National Organization for Women, they helped stop a bill that would have provided men with equal custody of their children.
Yeah, so I'll give you the backdrop for this.
Sure.
I got an email one day from Chris Sprowls, Sprowles, who was the Speaker of the House of Florida, and he said that he'd read the Boy Crisis book. He has 3 boys. It was very helpful for his wife and him in raising their 3 sons. He gave the Boy Crisis book to the head of the Republican and the Democratic heads of the family divisions of the House of Representatives in Florida. They loved it. They then started drawing up 2 pieces of legislation. Piece number 1 was the Fatherhood Crisis Bill. Piece number 2 was equal shared parenting bill. The good news was that the Fatherhood Crisis Bill passed the House of Representatives in Florida by the unanimous vote of every Republican and every Democrat. The other good news was that the equal shared parenting bill also passed both the House and the Senate. Then the next good news was that the Fatherhood Crisis Bill, which devoted $70 million to developing awareness of the importance of fathers, got also signed by Governor DeSantis. What did not get signed by Governor DeSantis was the equal shared parenting bill. That is really bad news. Now, I understand that there were 2 major groups opposed to it. One was the National Organization for Women in Florida. The other one was the American Bar Association or the Florida Bar Association.
That makes sense.
And those 2 apparently had enough power between the fact that women, politicians sometimes mistake the National Organization for Women for women, but that's a big mistake because 85% of men and women, approximately within about 1 or 2 percentage points of each other, feel that children after divorce should have equal rights to both the mother and the father after divorce. So the popular culture, parents, the voter, is very much in favor of children having both parents equally after divorce. But the power of the National Organization for Women lobby and the American Bar Association, since most state legislators are also lawyers, is very powerful. And so I was very sad that Governor DeSantis vetoed that part of the bill. And I am really angry and sad at DeSantis for doing that. And I'm also very pleased that he signed the Fatherhood Crisis Bill. And the reason I'm not, what I hope will come out of that is that as awareness is raised as to what exactly do fathers do that lead to children doing so much better when they have a father and mother in their life. That's the thing we need to understand. That's the thing that I spend a good part of time with the Boy Crisis on. When we understand that, there'll be more pressure to make sure that fathers are equally involved after divorce, both for children's sake, and it's also unfair for mothers who want to have any type of career to be so overwhelmed trying to take care of the children by themselves. Women need, single mothers need men to be involved and to step up and do take responsibilities with the children. Otherwise, single mothers are feeling, almost every one of them feels overwhelmed and guilty that they can't do their job with their children well enough, and they can't do their job in the workplace well enough.
Gotcha. We have another question here. 63 Daddy writes, if the men's rights movement was to focus on 2 to 3 most important but obtainable goals, what would these be in his opinion? And if you want, you can just, you don't have to elaborate.
Absolutely equal shared parenting.
Okay.
Second, make sure we lobby for the distribution of men's birth control, which I outlined the many different forms of it that are potentially available and within reach.
I don't know if you saw, I did an interview with the CEO of Next Life Sciences. They're the ones who are now developing vasal gel.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you...
I did not see that interview.
Yeah, I did an interview with him.
I know of that. And
yeah.
What was your takeaway?
Well, it had been in development for, I'd heard about it for, I think, a decade. It was in development by this company called the Parsimus Foundation. You know, they had made promises of human trials in 2016, 2017, never materialized. Now that it's, being pursued under this other company, Next Life Sciences, they're saying, hey, we're probably going to try to do human trials on vasal gel. I think they were aiming for, Eric, do you remember what it was, 2023 or 2024? Yeah. Yeah, human trials, I think, in 2024. So I think they're trying to really push for some, much quicker timeline that because I was a young buck when I heard about it, and I was like, okay, great,
Yeah.
great. I'm going to have some, because it would be nice to have a little peace of mind, because sometimes if they're on birth control, it doesn't always work. It's not 100%.
Exactly.
So,
And it's unfair for women to be the ones
Yeah.
responsible for birth control, and it's very dysfunctional. So, like you, I wrote a book called Father and Child Reunion in 2001. So this is 21 years ago. And 21 years ago, there was a lot of development and possibility of male birth control being available within the next 5, 6, 7, 10 years. And it hasn't happened in any significant way.
when was that? You said the book came out when?
2001.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so this is really deeply sad. And, there's a lot of reasons that are put forward for this, but there's no really good reason. If we cared as much about men having a birth control protection as women, I'm sure that we'd prioritize it to a much greater degree. And so that's sad. But if you're listening to this interview, in addition to reading up and studying up on these issues, reading The Boy Crisis and Myth of Male Power and things like that, I really ask you to go beyond just reading my books. I really ask you to become involved in the political process, involved in the speaking up process. Women can't hear what men don't say, and the culture can't hear what men don't say. The feminist movement has been so powerful because women have spoken up. Yes, maybe they've had more time, but we can't say men don't have the time. There's a great many people, watching football games, which is wonderful if you want to do that. But it also means you have time to do things other than that. So we men need to take that time out and speak up about our issues.
Do you think part of the issue with what you just said is, and I read about this, is that women have an in-group bias and men have a slight out-group bias for women? Do you think that's part of it, that
Yes,
we don't really, there's not as strong of a sense of a brotherhood whereas women, there's more a sense of a sisterhood?
It's the brotherhood. Well, it was what I was saying before, which is that we are biologically oriented to protect women. So when women complain, we men compete with each other to solve the problem. When men complain, we hear whining. We hear not a protector, but a whiner. And so we back out of the process.
Gotcha. So don't worry, we just had a little issue there. We're still live, right? Oh, Eric, can you fix that real quick? Sorry, guys, we're having a little technical issue. You're gonna have to go. Oh, okay. Can you pull back up OBS? Sorry, guys, we had a little tech issue there. So, okay, we have, let's see. Iron John just wants to really quick. Iron John MRA writes, ask him to tell you the story about how he met John Lennon. Can you just quickly
Yes.
tell us about that?
So I guess it was in the early 70s, I started the National Organization for Women. They were contemplating not allowing men to join. And they had a compromise. And the compromise is, we'll ask Warren Farrell to form some men's groups so that men will get out of women's hair during the women's consciousness raising group meetings that they had once per month. So I started forming these men's groups for now, and that they worked really well. And so I was living in New York City at the time, and so I formed a number of groups around New York. And a couple of years later, I came back to some celebration. I was writing for Ms. Magazine. They were having a big celebration. And so Gloria Steinem and I had agreed to sort of talk with each other at that meeting. And on my way, some guy comes up to me and stops me and says, "Are you Warren Farrell?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Well, I joined a men's group that you formed, but you had just left that men's group." And and I said, "Oh, that's interesting. What happened for you with it?" And he said, "Well, the reason I sought you out is because it really changed my life." And I said, "Well, how so?" And he said, "Well, and so we sat down together, and he started saying that when he was when he had his first child, that he was so involved with his business that his son that he had, he lost contact. He barely paid any attention to his son, barely paid any attention to his wife. The result of that was a divorce. And the result of the divorce was that, that he felt, deeply sad about that because he lost almost complete contact with the son. And so I said, so what's happening now? And he goes, well, I'm remarried to a woman here in the United States, and we just found out that she's pregnant with we had found out that she was pregnant with a son to be. And so I told this to the men's group, and the men's group said, well, and one of the questions I had asked the men's group to answer was for each man to go around and say, what is the biggest hole in your heart? And this guy named John, that you now know who it's going to be, said that the biggest hole in my heart was losing that contact and fearing that I will repeat the process, that my son will be born, I won't pay attention to him, I'll get a divorce. And the group said, well, what would you like to do, John, if you could do anything you wanted? And he said, if I could do anything I wanted, I'll just go with your fantasy for a while. It would be to take off 5 years and raise my son, and then go back to work after that. And the group said, well, have you talked to your wife, about that? And he said, no. And then the group persuaded me to talk to my wife about it. And I did. And she said, John, you've earned the right to do what you want to do. And so the group said, great, so you're going to do that? And he said, no, I have all these legal contracts. I can't, I'm a prisoner, basically. And the group said, well, so they confronted me, and they said, well, let's get this straight. You supposedly have all this power, and you're the prisoner of this power. If you're the prisoner of these legal contracts, then you don't have the power. The business owns you. You don't own the business. And he said, I really thought about that. And so I started to try to renegotiate many of those contracts. I was sued multiple times. But I did take 5 years off to take care of my son. I'm planning to do that. And I said, well, how old is your son now? And he said, he's a little bit, about 1.5 to 2, a little older than 1.5. And I said, was this a good decision? And he said, Warren, it wasn't a good decision. It was the best decision of my life to raise my son. He said, I always wrote about love and talked about love, but I never really knew what love was until everything that my son did, I cared about, I loved, I supported, I wanted to know more about. And at that time, somebody came over to me, and I just come back from my first book tour, and they came over to the table where he and I were sitting, and they had a piece of paper and said, would you sign that? And because I had no idea who this guy was, I thought they were asking me for a signature, and the guy goes, looks very awkwardly, and he says, well, actually, I would surely like your signature. He didn't even know who I was, and but could I get his signature first? And John takes the piece of paper, just quickly signs it, hands it back to him, and so I say, well, you must be well known I saw you, how quickly you did that. And he came over to you. He really didn't ask me for my signature after yours. What is your last name? And he goes, I really prefer, we've been talking for about an hour. He says, I really prefer just keeping it the way it was. And so, but then I pressed him and said, no, really, what is your last name? And he says, John Lennon. And I go, oh, now let's see, aren't you a member of a singing group? And he goes, yes. And I said, well, what's the name of that group again? And he goes, the Beatles. Well, my ignorance level had just been surpassed. I did know who the Beatles were. And then I felt really embarrassed. But I had been so focused on doing my doctoral dissertation in my first book, et cetera, that I didn't have a TV and didn't watch TV.
Gotcha.
So that was the John Lennon experience.
Super cool. And he was part of your men's groups.
Well, he was a part of a group I formed, but I never actually met him in the group until that period of time.
Well, from what I read in The Boy Crisis, it sort of sounded like you were almost, I don't know if you've seen the film or read the book, Fight Club. You were kind of like Tyler Durden, city to city, setting up these, I don't think there was violence at the the men's clubs that you were setting up, but
Definitely
or the
not.
men's
It
groups.
was the opposite of violence.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
But so we have a few questions from r/left-wing male advocates. So former election 9734 writes, does feminism and gender equality require a developed and relatively wealthy society as a necessary condition to exist?
First time I've had that question asked, and the brief answer is yes. And here's why. Historically speaking, we were the only issue that mattered was survival. And so, like I was saying before, we don't live in a patriarchal world that we were dominated by the need to survive. And like I talked about with my father. And so it's only once survival is taken care of that we can give permission for people even to divorce. It's why religions were part of a very strong effort to make sure that it was considered immoral and illegal oftentimes for there to be a divorce. And it was only as a given, so the boy crisis, for example, exists in the 63 largest developed nations. The word developed implies that society had to worry less about survival. Once it worried less about survival, it could ask about what rights do you want? I want the right to be able to live a life that I want to live. I want the right to be able to divorce, to be able, if I want to, not to have to live with somebody I hate for the rest of my life. I want the right to be able to have a passion in my work. And what ended up happening in most societies is because we have this biological propensity to protect females and not the biological propensity to protect males, is that women spoke up and said, I want the right to divorce. I want the right to be able to raise children by myself. I want abortion rights. I want the right to equal pay, which they actually had equal pay for the same work, but they didn't have equal pay for the different works that men and women did. And so they wanted all these rights. And we as men, as well as other women, had in common the propensity to compete for giving women their rights. We legislators competed to pass things in favor of women. The United Nations wrote all these things, to support women. Gender studies emerged. These are all privileges of a society that is free to go beyond worrying about survival. So the brief answer is yes. Got
it. That was a good question. We have another one from former election 9734. This one's kind of related to dating. So modern culture, this is there's a preamble to this question. Modern culture and the rise of feminism might have paradoxically brought society in a more prehistoric setting. So promiscuity is considerably more common, hookup culture, and as a consequence, different and maybe ancient social dynamics have developed. While before marriage was the rule, now sexual freedom and gender equality allow for the establishment of the Pareto principle. Most women chase after the top men, leaving the majority, or maybe a considerable amount, of men with little or no options in the dating and sexual market. This might also have been one of the causes of incel culture and might have promoted feelings of loneliness and frustration in part of the male population. What are Dr. Farrell's opinions on this matter, and does he think that gender liberation or gender equality is actually achievable in either a traditional society or the current modern society, since both seems to be intrinsically characterized by inherent differences between the sexes and their advantages and disadvantages?
Very thoughtful question.
Yes, very, very thoughtful.
and a little complex. So there's many dimensions to this. So by and large, that whole propensity that we have to protect women and men to compete doing that's an example of the fundamental differences between men and women. It's the reason we have all this concern for women's issues and no concern for men's issues. And that's going to be a really tough one to change, especially if men don't become aware of the fact that there's a really major price to be paid that is going to be hurting our sons and therefore our daughters. Every daughter who's heterosexual wants a man who's worthy of her love, especially if she's planning to have children. And so when that boy, when boys are failures to launch, when they're the ones dropping out of high school, when they're the ones that are becoming much more likely to be depressed, taking drugs, overdosing, committing suicide, these are all women's issues as well as men's issues. And so we need to be looking, we need to evolve past our genetic heritage, which is to protect females, and every female wants to protect every female, and every female allies with other women who want protection, and then the men divvy up and say, only a bunch of really anti-women people would ever want to talk about boys and men's rights. We need to talk about, we need to fight for women's rights. And so 90% of the culture is fighting for women's rights, and even places like the United Nations reflect a global propensity to only focus on women's rights and only applaud those men who support women's rights, and not the men who say that what we're really talking about is a future. The best future is not about men's rights or women's rights. I have no interest in a women's movement blaming men or a men's movement blaming women. I have always, from the first days, been in favor of a gender liberation movement in which both sexes recognize we need to be liberated from the rigid roles of the past to more flexible roles for our future. That's what's in the most optimal future. And we're stuck in a blame game at this point in history that we boys and men need to speak up about, or we won't emerge from that blame game because, as I mentioned before, women can't hear what men don't say, and we aren't saying.
Got it. We have a question here from Law Unto Chaos. Law Unto Chaos writes, do you think that when it comes to men sharing emotions, there is too much focus on the fact that men don't share their emotions and not enough on how society actually reacts when we do?
Probably yes is the answer to that, but those are very interrelated. We as men have to learn to share our emotions and our feelings and our fears and pay the price for that. And part of what those emotions, feelings, and fears are about is that when you, as a woman, or as in, let's say a man is in, I've heard this scenario so many times, a man really is supporting women, and he joins a women's studies course, and there's only 2 or 3 men in the course, and the rest are women. And the women are saying, well, would you speak up and give the male perspective? And then he gives a male perspective, not the male perspective, but a male perspective. And he says, whenever, there needs to be male birth control, or there needs to be men's opinions on this or that or the other thing, like I've already talked about. And then the women almost all, they tell me, jump down his throat. And suddenly see him as a possible enemy, unless he speaks up in a way of saying that men should support what the women in the class are saying. And so we have to pay the price. When I was speaking up only on women's issues, I was getting huge contracts. I was making a great deal of money. I was, everything I wrote for the New York Times was published. I was on all the major TV shows. I was, I never got anything but a standing ovation. And when I started integrating the learning experiences I heard from the boys and the men's groups, and I started integrating the men's groups' feelings into my speeches, my standing ovations turned to sitting ovations, and my 4 or 5 recommendations for speaking engagements per talk, they fizzled down to 2, then 1, then 0. I've lost somewhere between $10 and $25 million, to speak up on behalf of boys and men's issues.
Wow.
And so that's a price you're going to have to pay. But so figure out a way of being sustainable first. I made sure that before I went too far, that I saw the way the direction was going.
Did you go too far?
Oh no! Before I
don't think so. But
no, I don't feel I've ever gone too far.
Yeah.
But as I started speaking up more and more about these issues, and seeing my standing ovations disappear, et cetera, I began to realize I'm going to not have the wealth in the future that I have now. So I began to really be very fortunately. My father was a good, knowledgeable about finances and markets, and taught me a lot about taking financial responsibility. So I made sure I saved up 3 years worth of income, so I could afford to lose money for a while I got my act together to publish books that began to articulate something other than women's issues.
So since you sort of made the shift to talk more about men's issues, so in total, you think you've lost out on, you said 10 to 25 million? Because to me, it seems like you're sort of at the forefront of a lot of this conversation about the ways in which men and boys are disadvantaged. But so you've lost, you think you've lost out.
My best guess.
Guys, buy his book, The Boy Crisis. We need also the myth of male power. But
or don't buy his book, and then you can say he lost 22 million, maybe.
Yeah, protect.
You can play a better victim.
Protect Warren Farrell at all costs. So we actually have another question here that's sort of related a little bit to what you just said. So Hot Take Toothache writes, some really great names here. My understanding of your history is that when you first tried to broach men's issues, you expected your feminist colleagues, and perhaps women more generally, to be at least somewhat receptive to the idea. The way you have described their reaction, I think, was the opposite. Given your 30 years of experience with the resistance to even the basic notion that men's issues deserve a place in the conversation, has that changed your assessment of women's nature or of how men should think about their relationships with women? That's from Hot Take Toothache.
Yeah, really important and good question. I did begin to see the resistance of my feminist colleagues initially when in the 70s, I began to see that there was a big increase in divorces. And I started to, and then there was the emergence of early research showing that the children that were in divorce situations were not doing very well. And then there was some statistical breakdown showing that the ones that did not have father involvement were doing significantly poorly. So I brought this issue up to my board members of the National Organization for Women in about 1972. And they said, and I was expecting, because all these women were my friends, I thought. And I brought this issue up, and the response was cold silence. And finally, one woman, I guess embarrassed about the silence, said, Warren, we're the National Organization for Women. We have a lot of things we're fighting for. Feminists join us so that with the expectation that if there's a divorce, we'll support their right to have the children and to make the decisions as to what's best for the children. If we start saying that we want men to have equal rights to the children, we're going to lose membership, and not only lose it on the custody issue, but lose it on all the issues that we're fighting for. And so I said, but this is when a woman makes a decision to, I said, you all know I 100% support women's rights, but when a woman has the right to make a decision to have a child, she has the right to take the she's making a decision to take responsibility for someone other than herself. And so if what's good for the children is having both parents after the divorce, and then she has the responsibility to make that decision. And again, there was sort of silence. And one of the women picked up on the fact that I said this was just the beginning of the research, because longitudinal studies were needed to see if the child was only doing poorly for a year or two or three, but maybe 5, 10, 15 years down the road, it wouldn't make any difference. So she picked up and she said, well, Warren, why don't you do more research on that? But a lot of your speaking engagements come from the fact that we're recommending you all over the place. And so, that was all that needed to be said. And so I knew from that moment on that if I continued doing the research that found that children needed both parents after divorce, that those recommendations wouldn't be coming in, that I would probably reach more hostility. Now, there was another second level part of that question, which was, has this changed my experience about women? And yes, in a way it has. Whereas before I probably had the bias of women being very empathetic, what I came to understand is that there was something deeper going on than the empathy alone, which was a desire on the part of women to be protected and to have rights, and to expect men to provide those rights for them and provide the protection for them. And that was a very deep fundamental difference between the genders that we were going to take a lot longer to resolve. And I knew I started to evolve at understanding that these issues would not be solved in my lifetime.
Do you consider yourself a feminist?
No, not in the way feminist. I consider myself a feminist if feminist is defined if feminism is defined as providing. I'm sorry, I just wanted. Yeah, we're doing an exchange of water before. If feminism is defined as women and men having equal rights and taking on equal responsibilities, and hearing each other, then I'm a feminist in that. But the way feminism has evolved is feminism in its present form in 2022 has many toxicities to it. And the toxicities of blaming men and honing victimhood as a fine art, and having gender studies not incorporate male issues, and having things like the White House Gender Policy Council, which even though it's a gender policy council, the White House Gender Policy Council specifically puts in writing that it is only concerned with women's issues and girls' issues, not men's issues and boys' issues. Mm-hmm. And when we define feminism and gender in that way, I am very much opposed to that aspect of feminism. What I am in favor of is the feminism that opens up sports to women, that opens up opportunities for women, that opens up law schools and medical schools and respects women. But when women focus on honing victimhood as a fine art, people who are professional victims do not receive respect. They receive fear. They may get further. They may have a type of power, but it's not a healthy type of power.
I'll talk a bit just to give you an opportunity to pour the water there. Yeah, I guess my thoughts on feminism is I consider myself an egalitarian.
Yes.
Feminism seems to me it's not really at least my sense of it, it's not really an equality movement. To paint it in the most generous light, I would say it's a woman's advocacy movement. Not that there's anything wrong with women's advocacy, but it's not often that. I think the thing that I commonly think of is in scenarios where equality would not come at the benefit or to the benefit of women, feminists will not fight for said equality.
Correct.
So
it's a pick and choose liberation movement.
So it necessarily is not an equality movement if it's not a, equality in my view, it's not a buffet. You don't get to pick and choose the equality that you want and that you don't want. You just have to, you either should have equality across the board or acknowledge the differences, I guess. But.
I 100% agree with you, A. And B, there's a huge difference between equality of outcome and equality of opportunity.
Yes.
And so I think you and I are both in favor of equality of opportunity in every area possible. But even in places where equality is very strong, like Sweden, we see that there's even more differentiation between male jobs and female jobs in Sweden than there is in the United States. And so there are fundamental differences between men and women. And to have things like the male only draft registration, and the feminist movement take no interest in making sure that that's equal numbers of men and women have to sign up for the draft or have to take some type of responsibility, or that there's that judges that are constantly assigning, that giving women the right to children and men have to fight for children after divorce, that's not about equality. And so these are just two of, dozens of issues that women claiming that men are making more than women for the same work, which is just, I wrote a whole book on this issue called Why Men Earn More and What Women Can Do About It. And this is a very important issue because from my perspective, if men earned 1 penny more than women did for the same work, in the same way, in the same places, the same dimensions, I would be opposed to that. But in fact, there's 25 differences in the decisions that men and women make around the workplace. And each of those decisions leads to men earning more money. Men are much more likely to do the hazardous jobs, jobs that nobody wants to do, like picking up garbage, and so on. And those types of things pay more for somebody with the same education because nobody wants to do them. And so the fulfilling jobs that the more fulfilling the job is, the less it pays because more people want to do it. So you have a supply and demand issue. And so, and men and women do not earn differently when all those variables are controlled for. It's probably true that women earn slightly more than men do for all those variables being controlled for, but the variables are so overlapping that it's absolutely impossible to say for sure.
Yeah, I think you had talked about this. I'm not sure, it might have been in the Boy Crisis, or I don't know if these stats had came out when you wrote Why Men Earn More, but I had read that in many metropolitan cities, women who are never been married, don't have children, single childless women actually out-earn their male counterparts.
That was in Why Men Earn More, yes.
Yeah, I think, and I saw in the Boy Crisis, it's not a difference between, I don't want to misquote it, it's not a difference between men and women, it's a difference between moms and dads?
That's right, yes.
I don't know if I'm misquoting it there, but...
No, that's exactly what I say.
Okay.
Well, first of all, so just so people listening get this data down perfectly. So the difference, never married women who have never had children, so this is not just never married women, but never married women who have never had children, have out-earned males who have never been married and never had children by 117% as early as in the 1970s. And so that gives you a sense of when a man is never married and never had children, he can do things like being an artist or being a writer or being an actor and not succeeding, or doing music gigs or teaching in an elementary school. And so he doesn't focus on money when he's never been married and never had children. And so whereas a woman who's never been married and never has children has to focus on her career and pay more attention to it than she would if she was a middle-class woman who was married. And so, and that's one of the reasons for that. And that gives you a real sense about equality. And of course, today, many women are far more likely to they're much more likely to become doctors and lawyers, but a very high percentage of women, once they have children, unbecome doctors for a number of years. And then they're away from the science and away from their practice, and they're not building it up as much. And so when you compare male doctors to female doctors, you still have a gap in pay between male doctors and female doctors, with male doctors earning more. But when you then control for, male doctors that have been working for the last 20 years with female doctors that have been working for the last 20 years without stopping, and then both working for the same type of, either as in an independent practice or not, and they have the same amount of degrees behind them and so on, the same type of specializations. When you control for all of that, then you don't get a gender gap. And so that's, and what you said before is exactly right. It's not, the gender gap is not between men and women as a whole, it's between fathers and mothers. Because once you become a father and mother, women are far more likely to put more focus on raising children, and dads are far more likely to put more focus on raising money.
Yeah, I mean, from what I've read and from some of the things you've written, there's a myriad of factors that contribute to the supposed wage gap. I've heard it's not so much a wage gap, it's an earnings gap. But kind of related to this and related to gaps, and I don't know if it's you that coined this term. So you often hear the glass ceiling, right? Women are excluded from some of these really top tier positions, but you don't often hear about the glass cellar, where a large portion of men, while there's a small portion of men that do occupy the top positions in professions and in politics, there's a large amount of men that occupy the lowest positions, the dangerous jobs, the dirty jobs, the jobs where there's risk of death or severe injury. But speaking of gaps,
that's first of all, that's correct, and I did coin that term in the Myth of Male Power.
Yeah.
I have a whole section on the glass cellar.
Yeah.
And among those is one of the things you pointed out that ironically the UN pointed out by saying, catastrophically, 1 in 4 homeless people are women. Well, part of the glass cellar is that 3 in 4 of the homeless people are men, and that still understates the issue. A higher percentage of homeless that are street homeless are men, even than the 1 in 4. But the homeless includes in the UN statistic sheltered homeless, and a high percentage of the homeless that are sheltered are women. And
I heard that. So it's something. Is it 80% of men are homeless, something around there?
The street homeless. Right?
Yeah, and then of the homeless, I think it's 90% are likely to be rough sleepers, so that they're on the street or sleeping outside, whereas the women who are homeless, they might be in their car or in a shelter. So it even the stat about just breaking down the homelessness ratio, it doesn't paint a full picture of what's really going on and how it's worse for men. But I mean, just going back to the gaps thing, I mean, if we assume there's a wage gap, like why don't we ever, talk about the dangerous job gap, the more likely to die on the job gap, more likely to be electrocuted to death gap, the more likely to be crushed to death gap, more likely to fall to their death gap. I mean, there's, you see these videos of these iron workers, even today, but back in, when they were constructing these skyscrapers back in the early 1900s, they didn't have straps on. They were walking along. There was an OSHA, back then, and these men would fall to their deaths, and it's just, I don't know. So.
And when OSHA, part of the reason OSHA developed and got more and more regulations was that when scaffolding, for example, in New York, fell down and killed a woman who was a pedestrian. And it was at that point that the New York State Legislature started to realize that there needed to be better scaffolding, not because a man was killed, as many men had been from the poor scaffolding, but because a female was finally killed. And so it is quite amazing this biological instinct to protect women and to be okay with the disposability of males. And all your hazardous professions are largely male dominated, and that's part of the glass cellar. But it's worse than appears to be, because, for example, our firefighters are much more likely to be men, and volunteer firefighters are much more likely to be men. And we know that firefighters die very early, but what we don't know is that on the job. But what also happens is we haven't calculated the remnant deaths. So, for example, a good friend of mine who was a firefighter, right after he retired, he nevertheless died of lung cancer, and he had gotten he had the remnant death of constantly taking in that smoke that poisoned him, that led to him dying sooner. Gotcha.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of gaps, I guess, that you can talk about. I mean, there's, and I was just talking more so coming at it from the angle of the wage gap. There's, anyways, we'll move on. But got a few more questions here from Reddit, and then do we have you for a bit longer?
No, actually, I was just going to say we need to end. Thank you for asking. I appreciate that.
Could we do just like 3 more questions? Is that?
Yes, and the other issue is that I have to use the restroom.
You know what? Do you want to go use the restroom? I can pull up a video of you on Oprah.
Terrific.
And then we could do maybe another 5-10 minutes.
That's
Would that
fine.
be okay?
Yes, we can do that. Thank you.
Eric, can you pull up a video while we take a little intermission here? Can you play? Yeah, just go ahead and play the Oprah one while we take a quick break here.
Tony, here comes somebody who agrees with you. My next guest calls the idea of men paying for everything the prostitute syndrome. Warren Farrell is author of the book, Why Men Are the Way They Are. Also joining us is romance consultant Rebecca Sidnor, who's author of Making Love Happen. Rebecca says, a man who wants to split the bill is looking for a buddy, not a romance.
And she
Rebecca?
And she wrote Making Love Happen?
Oprah, sometimes some things just don't change no matter how liberated we are. And romance and courtship is one of those things. In the beginning, if a man pays for dinner on a first date, it's clear that he's interested in romance. But if he doesn't, and he comes across as liberated, he's looking more for a friendship. And some men will pay sometimes and sometimes not pay. So that's a mixed message to me.
When a man and a woman meet on the first date and a man doesn't pay, what he's saying is, I respect you. I want a woman. No, wait, hold for a minute. He's saying, I want a woman who is, you've been talking about liberation, you've been talking about wanting to be listened to, you've been talking about being your own person. I believe you. I want a woman who will, when the check comes, doesn't walk away to the ladies' room and expect that I'm going to be your success object, that I'm going to be your wallet. I don't want a prostitute in my life. I want a woman.
But when you say
that a man can't afford you, basically what you're asking the guy to do is take the money out and say, how much, honey? 20, 40? And she just says it, right. It's that this money isn't good enough. She wants the gold card. There's what she wants. See that? Now, you have to ask yourself a question.
That's a good point.
Is there any difference?
Wait.
We have to ask, is there any difference between Abby and a prostitute?
No. Oh, yes, sir. Excuse me. Could you answer my question?
But Oprah, I agree with this.
Answer my
I agree with this woman.
Answer my question, please. Do you ask women out?
What's that?
Do you ask women out?
Of course, I asked some women out, and many women asked me out.
I'm not finished.
Go ahead.
You ask a woman out for the evening. You go to a restaurant, you're not going to pay. You ask me out, and I'm going to get to a restaurant, and you expect me to put out money?
No, I agree. Lauren, I'm on your side, but I have to agree with her. If you ask somebody out, you pay.
An prostitute, because you expect me to, I expect you to pay for my dinner. That makes me a prostitute. You should go for counsel.
Are you asking?
Rebecca, I'll give you a chance.
We have to ask ourselves a question. Warren? If we want men to express their emotions, and then you ask a question and you create the answer, and you make an accusation like you should go to counseling before you get an answer, that's the type of person who themselves needs counseling. No, wait a minute. I'm sorry.
Me, you pay. I ask you, I pay.
I am trying to respond to you.
What about, let him explain what
I am trying to respond to your question. We have in this society a double jeopardy. We first tell men, you have to ask women out. And then we say, men, you have to risk all the rejection about taking 150 risks of rejection between first eye contact and first intercourse. And then we say, men, you have to pay, having risked the rejection to ask her out, and then you have to pay to risk the rejection to be sexual with her. And then so it's the only place in society where we tell people they have to pay for rejection.
On the other hand, how many men have you asked out and paid the check?
Exactly.
Yeah.
How many men?
There's been plenty. I mean, I'm married now, but there's been plenty.
You did pay.
Yes,
when you were single, you asked men out and paid the check.
Many times when we were dating. I'm sorry, a date is a date, and that's what we're getting down here. Basic.
He should pay.
No, if a guy asks a girl out, he should pay.
That's right. Well, I agree with that.
Absolutely. There's a but to that. Any girl that asks a guy to take her somewhere or to buy her something has no class whatsoever.
Warren?
All right, those people were quite some characters. That was you on Oprah.
I was one of those characters.
Yes. Yeah, I liked the. You had some great energy there in that. And we won't stay too well. We won't really cover that. Maybe if we get you back on the show. So good for just another 5-10 minutes just to wrap up here. Okay, so we have a question from. Let's see. This is from r/Where are all the good men on Reddit? NoHo 2.0 writes. Let's see. This question is related to the National Organization for Women. I feel like we kind of already touched on that. Let me just see here. Okay, so NoHo 2.0 writes, I'm a MGTOW. Are you familiar with
Yes, sure.
Men going their own way?
Going their own way.
Yeah, I'm a MGTOW monk dad that has sworn off dating and relationships due to the cost-benefit risk analysis. Modern North American women simply do not add enough value for me to take on the costs and risks. I'm not alone here, and I see many of my brothers making the same calculations. Right now, I see the trajectory as rather bleak regarding gender wars and reconciliation. How does Dr. Farrell see things? What is his real, no bullshit prognosis for the state of male to female relations in the West? That's from NoHo 2.0.
Yes. Well, first of all, MGTOW, men going their own way, and incel, involuntarily celibate.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about those things, it's really very sad that we've moved to a place where the incels, who are given a really major bad rap, and some of them have a really negative attitude toward the world and people, but essentially the word is not that is celibate or voluntarily celibate, it's involuntarily celibate. And that implies that somebody wants to be involved, wants to not be celibate, or many MGTOW people, it's not that they're saying, I don't want to be in a heterosexual relationship, but the risks that I take are so great that it makes me worry about, if I have, and the most important worry is that when a man and a woman have sex, when a man puts his penis in a woman's body, he puts his life in her hands. And if they have a baby, and he's not even able to see that child, that's for many men who have hearts and who care and who love and who have feelings about not having a child to be able to be with afterwards. Those men can end up sealing off their desire to be with women. That's sad for women. That's sad for those men. And we really have to ask ourselves: do we want to be in a society where one sex is just saying, I feel hopeless like that? And there are women who feel that the other way around, that it's that there's so much of a risk of domestic violence, there's so much a risk of being divorced or so on, that I mentioned before that 42% of women who have children in the United States have children without being married, and in some ways they're going their own way also. And so the bigger issue here is a complete lack of really good communication between men and women, where women are building up this increased amount of anger that there's no worthy of men, and men are building up this increased amount of hurt and anger that there is that I cannot risk having children without and because the world is going to treat me in a way that isn't good in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. The only thing I want to say here is, we men who, well, not we, because I'm very happily married, but men who do go their own way, speak less about cost-benefit analysis and speak from your heart. Let your heart lead, and then people will hear us more easily. Gotcha.
We have a question here from White Horse 2021. Morgan, let's see. Maybe you already touched on this, but he asked for your thoughts on the unregulated sexual marketplace, where 80% of men are deemed unattractive and only 4.5% of men are pursued by the vast majority of women. Any
Yes.
thoughts there?
Yeah, this is a place where we really have to have dialogue. This is true, by the way, not only in the United States, but all over the world. So, for example, Chinese equivalents of Match.com, when they interview women for the Match.com equivalent, find that about 90% of the women want men that have both a home, that own a home and own a car. But only about, I think it's 5-6% of the men on the website own both a home and a car.
Wow.
And so you have just exactly what this person said. You have this enormous number of women competing for a very tiny percentage of men. And so then the pressure from the female point of view is when a woman gets a man, let's say a woman is doing very well, and there's a man that's a secretary out there or a plumber, and she goes home to her mom and dad and says, oh, I met this wonderful guy online, and he's a plumber or a secretary or whatever, or an elementary school teacher. Oftentimes the response on the part of the parents is like, wasn't that guy, what happened to the guy who was that lawyer that you were dating, or the one that was going to medical school? And so the woman feels pressure from her parents to consider disproportionately the man who is likely to be successful, and it's not just from the parents; it's from women friends too. It's like the same type of question from women friends. Well, didn't you date a guy some time ago that was that was going to medical school? What happened with him? And so the woman picks up the hint that even if she has broken away from the stereotype of the only good man is a man that earns more money or soon will than I do. That she gets that pressure often from parents and from peers.
Last question here for you. So you've had over 1,000 TV show and radio appearances. You've appeared on Oprah, Barbara Walters, Charlie Rose, Larry King, Jordan Peterson's podcast, and numerous other notable platforms. What is one question that you would have liked to have been asked, if you can think of one?
God, that is a great question. Wow. That may be the first question I've ever been asked to which I do not know the answer.
Well, I'm kind of...
That's really very, very, very fascinating. I mean, a lot of... I guess the question I would most like to be asked is, talk to me about how men are hurting. Talk to me about men's pain. Talk to me about how boys are feeling left out and undermined, and about their pain. Talk to me about a father's pain when he can't see his child. I mean, the men that I have been contacted by, the fathers that have the tears that they have shed, and yet in order to be able to afford to fight for the children, they have to spend an average of about $150,000. And that means that they have to be wealthy enough to be able to afford to hire the lawyers and the expert witnesses. And that means they have to be devoted enough to their work to take them away from involvement with the children. And so many men are feeling alone and hurt and in pain. And so I'd like to have people ask me more about that pain.
I think that was a great answer to that question. Last thing, what's the word on your upcoming book, The Paradox of Male Power? Is that...
Yes.
Are you still working on that? Or?
I've just signed a contract to do 2 new books.
Oh, 2. Okay.
And the first one, because Jordan Peterson has asked me to do, to join Peterson Academy and become one of his thought leaders that will be presenting a workshop. And he would prefer me doing, I've been doing for 30 years couples communication workshops around the country. And he felt that would appeal to a wider audience than the boy crisis would. And I feel that also. I care more about people understanding everybody having compassion and empathy for people's different points of view. And I've discovered something in the process of creating the communication system that is really revolutionary. And so so I'm doing a book on that issue first called Role Mate to Soulmate. And the subtitle is The Art and Discipline of Love. And so that's, unfortunately, that's available now. If someone is interested, they can go to my warrenfarrell.com website and just look for couples communication. And I've done an online course on that that's available very inexpensively. And so, but it's only good if you and your partner, somebody in your life that you care about, do it together. It's not something just to be intellectually listened to. And then, so I'm doing my next book on that, so to coincide with Jordan Peterson coming out with the couples course. And then I'm right after that, and that's due February 28th. And so right after that, I'm committed to do a new book called The Paradox of Male Power. And I'm calling it Paradox rather than the Myth of Male Power, because the average person seeing Myth of Male Power says, oh, well, wait a minute, a lot of men have all this power. And so I'm acknowledging that to many women, a man who's the CEO or whatever feels like he has a lot, from her perspective, he has a lot of power. But at the same time, there's a whole perspective that he has, maybe about the drive, that he wouldn't be worthy unless he earned more money after they had children, that leads to a type of powerlessness. And so I'm calling it the paradox of male power. And that's due about a year or so beyond February 28th of this year, of next year. Right?
Well, very much looking forward to your, sounds like you said 2 books coming?
2 books,
Two
yes.
new books coming out. Okay. Well, Warren Farrell, thank you so much for joining me. Everyone, please check out his books, The Boy Crisis. He's got quite a few. The Myth of Male Power. Great reads. They're also available. Let's see, that we have all the links are in the description. They're available in audiobook format and regular book format. And any final thoughts or?
Yeah, and just, if money is an issue for you, Amazon is really doing a lot of good stuff with it. I understand that on next Monday, they're going to be putting the Kindle version of The Boy Crisis on sale for $2.99. Wow. Which is quite a deal, but a lot of people enjoy doing the reading of the paperback, and that's pretty inexpensive, and it's on a significant sale also on Amazon. Great.
Yeah, and also it's on Audible too. I think
yes.
I mentioned the audio book. So, yeah. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Sorry for those of you who submitted your questions on Reddit if we weren't able to get to it. I'm sure maybe we'll have an opportunity perhaps in the future to have Warren come back on and we can hit some of those questions. But anyways, yeah, we have a dating talk podcast at 7 p.m. tonight. Unfortunately, Warren won't be able to join us, but perhaps maybe in the future. So be sure to tune into that 7 p.m. tonight for the Dating Talk podcast. And thank you again, Warren, for joining me. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we will see you soon. The Boy Crisis, it's available.